You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Good morning, friends, and welcome to the Catholic Novelists webinar. Catholic novelists provide an important imaginative link between our material and spiritual worlds. My name is Sebastian Mahfood, and I'm the publisher of En Route Books and Media, located in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm delighted to share with you today the testimonies of 5 of our Catholic novelists: Rick Akins, Ben Bongers, Danny Fitzpatrick, James Papandrea, and Lucy Underwood-Healy. We begin, as in all things, with prayer, led by En Route author and writer of over 80 books, Rhonda Chervin. Rhonda?
Oh, dear Holy Spirit, we thank you for the gift of storytelling. And we thank you for the fact that we don't just have in the world facts and syllogisms, but also have wonderful novels and poems that have graced our lives. And we ask you to bless today and fast forward all of the writers here of novels, and bless the books they've already written, and bless the sales of those books so that people may benefit. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Rhonda. So we'll begin with Rick Akins. He is the father of 3. He was born and raised Catholic in upstate New York and has an electrical engineering degree and an MBA from the University of Illinois. Aside from his historical novel, The Rebirth of Nicodemus, Rick's book, Romans by Paul, offers a strong defense of our Catholic faith. Rick, take it away.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm actually in Illinois right now as we speak, and we're going through a huge storm. So hopefully my internet will hold up. But I just wanted to thank, on behalf of all of us as authors, I want to thank you, Sebastian, for putting this together, for all the help you've given us over the years and polishing up our work and getting it out on a platform for us. So I thank you very much for that. And so I'm first up due to the name my father gave us as a family name. So I just wanted to go through my novel that came out 2 years ago, 2020, called, right here, if you can see it, Rebirth of Nicodemus. And it's a historical novel about the Pharisee Nicodemus back in the time of Jesus. So what I'd like to do in the time that we have is just kind of give an overview of the story itself, where it came from. Whenever I watch interviews with authors, that's my first question all the time. Like, where did you come up with this idea in the first place? So we'll talk about that a little bit and a little bit about the story itself. And then, kind of my feeling on why it's important that all of us are going through the work that we do and trying to create not just nonfiction type defenses of our faith, but actually being able to tell a good story, a good Christian Catholic story. So this particular story for the Rebirth of Nicodemus came literally in a flash as I was sitting at Mass back in 2019. It was the week after New Year's, and the reading at the gospel reading that week was the story of the Magi coming to King Herod and asking King Herod where the king, the newborn king of the Jews, was, and of course upset King Herod. And he went to the Pharisees and scribes and asked those Jewish experts to, according to the scriptures, where was the newborn king of the Jews supposed to be born? And of course he's what they found in the scriptures was that Jesus was to be born, the Messiah was going to be born in Bethlehem. So they tell him this, and then King Herod sends the Magi on their way. They don't come back to him, so he gets more and more upset because his kingship is being threatened. So he sends his troops in, and they wipe out all the children, all the boys 2 years and older, or 2 years and younger, in the area of Bethlehem. So it's well known as, sometimes called the slaughter of the innocents. And as I sat there, and like all of us, I probably had heard or read that story 30 or 40 times in my life at that point. What suddenly hit me was, what must it have been like for that scribe or that Pharisee or those group of scribes and Pharisees who told King Herod where Jesus was going to be born, and then you find out a couple of days later that Herod has gone out and slaughtered all these children. Like, what must that have been like for that person? And that was really the starting point for this story. I went back, I did a little research. I wanted to base the story on a real character from the scriptures, not make up a scribe. And the Pharisee, the most famous Pharisee, other than the high priest in all the scriptures, Nicodemus. So he became my primary protagonist in the story. And the idea was that he then grows up to be a leader in the Jewish community and a Pharisee who in John chapter 3 comes to Jesus. And it's very famous because that interchange is where Jesus tells him that he needs to be reborn in order to enter the kingdom of God. So my thought in the book is, here's this very, very devout Jew who thinks he's serving God, and yet he knows that at a time of turmoil, he gave in and told Herod where Jesus would be born. He betrayed Jesus. He betrayed all these young boys who ended up being killed. So that kind of suddenly hooked me into this story. And what I next had to do was try to figure out how to put the pieces together, how to put the chronology together and all that. And I realized when you read through the Gospels that Nicodemus is mentioned 5 times, and all 5 times are in the book of the Gospel of John. So my thought was, well, that's a nice tie-in, because what makes the most sense to me is that John went to Nicodemus and interviewed Nicodemus to get these stories from him, because none of the other gospel accounts have Nicodemus in it. So now the story has 2 prongs to it. We're following Nicodemus and his internal guilt that he still feels, and also we're following the Apostle John. Now, John's got his own problems, because at the time the book starts, we're in 70 AD, and the reason that John has come to Nicodemus to try to get an idea, or all the facts clear for his gospel, is because he's the last surviving apostle. And now I put myself into the position of John, and you're the last surviving of the 12 apostles, and you must have everyone, all the Christians in the infant church, coming to you saying, expecting that you too are going to be martyred soon, and expecting and demanding that you write everything you can down about Jesus. And here's this fisherman who's now asked to write something that important. And so we follow John through this story as well, trying to overcome his own self-doubt and trying to figure out what it is that he is supposed to write. So all of that plays in together into a perfect timeline, because now to get John to come to Nicodemus after everybody else is martyred means that we're after Peter and Paul have been martyred. So now we're about 69 or 70 AD, after they've been martyred in Rome and had time, for the story to get out to everyone, because John is in Ephesus at this point. Then John has to make it to Jerusalem to find Nicodemus, because he still knows Nicodemus is alive, and he's one of the few at that point living eyewitnesses of Jesus. And in the gospel, we find out that Nicodemus was actually there also with Joseph of Arimathea to bury Jesus after the crucifixion. So now John shows up to meet with Nicodemus and get his story, and it's AD 70. What happens in AD 70 in real life? The Romans come back to Jerusalem. So now he shows up as a leader of the Christian church to talk to a leader, an old, at this point, Nicodemus is in his 80s, an old leader of the Jewish faith. And they're both being threatened because now the Roman legions are marching on Jerusalem, which actually did happen at that point. So that was the kind of the push, the starting point for the story. And then in the story, Nicodemus has both a daughter and a granddaughter. Both of them have been martyred. Their husbands were killed when the Jews had their uprising against the Romans a few years earlier and kicked the Romans out of Jerusalem. So Nicodemus has not only the guilt of or trying to figure out what the best solution is to protect his daughter and granddaughter, but he's trying to figure out also, like, he's been living with this overwhelming guilt in his own life from what he did back when he was a teenager and gave the information to Herod that led to the murder of all these children. So that's as we go through the story, we see, as we get toward the end of the story, two major things come together at once. The temple in Jerusalem is destroyed, so John leads Nicodemus and his family away from Jerusalem, and they head back to Ephesus. And during that process, we see John starting to understand what it really is as a Christian in the first century. At this point, 30 or 40 years after the crucifixion. And now he has no doubts left. He has just witnessed the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. And he is starting to understand finally, that he and the fellow Christians are God's people and they're the ones, moving forward. So he comes to the point at the very end of the story where he's giving his homily to his parish and the believers in Ephesus, and we hear those great words that he has in the opening to the prologue to his gospel. That in the beginning was God, and the Word was with God, because the Word was God, and he had to go through all of this process with witnessing the destruction of the temple and all of the rest, to come to that final conclusion and to be able to put it into words that, everyone moving forward, would describe who Jesus was in a very special way. And then at the same time, Nicodemus now has had his entire world shattered because God did not protect the temple. And he's seen the destruction of his entire way of life. And now he's kind of, in a way, being dragged along with John and still feeling guilty of everything that's happened. Now feeling more guilty because he wasn't able to help stop the attack on the temple. But when he gets to Ephesus and he hears John's words, he finally comes to faith in Christ to the point that he seeks his forgiveness. And for the first time in his entire life, he feels like his personal guilt has been released. So the whole goal of the story is to give some detail as to maybe, where we get these great words at the beginning of John's gospel, how, without being too preachy about it, how someone can overcome their personal guilt through faith in Jesus. And then as I went through and tried to put different gospel stories into a narrative, we get some really cool scenes, I think, as well, such as when Nicodemus, who did stand up for Jesus in front of the other, when he was condemned, is working with Joseph to bury Jesus in Joseph's tomb. And we get the scene where he lifts up Jesus's, cold dead body after the crucifixion. And just to put that into more of a tactile, real, what would all of us feel like at that point? It really kind of hit home for me that it's a dead body here, right? So Nicodemus is not able in subsequent years to believe that Jesus came back from the dead, because he literally buried his dead body. So I think some of those little tidbits that I came across as I researched the book and really thought through what the people in the scriptures actually went through really helped my faith, and hopefully will help other people's faith as well through reading the book.
Thank you, Rick. For our next author, Ben Bongers was an international operatic tenor and sommelier for 30 years based in San Francisco, California, and Germany, and is now a gerontologist. He is currently studying for the permanent diaconate in Kansas City, Missouri, and is a Knight of Magisterial Grace in the Order of Malta. Among his books published this year are The St. Nicholas Society, True Love, 12 Christmas Stories My True Love Gave to Me, and The Farmer, the Miner, and the Artisan, which was just published this weekend. So, Ben, take it away.
Thank you, Sebastian. It's great to be here. I know we have 15 minutes, so I better get right to it. My first book, The St. Nicholas Society, again, we're always asked, why did we write something? I had no desire whatsoever to become an author. I was taking care of my parents long distance at the time, and I was flying back and forth from San Francisco, California, to Clearwater, Florida. So I understand the Florida warm right now. One day I had written for wine magazines, and I'd written for opera magazines, and wrote a textbook for gerontology, but I had no desire to write a novel. I got on a flight, and I just had an inspiration of some kind to put down an outline. We took off. 5 hours later, as I was landing in Tampa, I hit the end on the end of the outline. The book was done. Now I just needed to flesh it out. It took about 2 to 3 years of research on St. Nicholas. Again, the name of the book is St. Nicholas Society. And I luckily worked hand in glove with St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park, just south of San Francisco. So I dug in and did my research through Eusebius and some of the actual writings of St. Nicholas. I worked very closely with the with the Dominican in Bari, Italy, who actually oversees the tomb of St. Nicholas of Myra. I went through theologians, church historians, you name it. I got all different kinds of help for the book. It's basically a double novel. It's a novel of the autobiography, because it's written in first person, of St. Nicholas of Myra, from his early years when he was orphaned at a very early age, and all the way through to his death, his entire life. And we find out through the book, we really don't know who St. Nicholas was until we read his real history. He's not the jolly old fellow dressed in red saying ho, ho, ho. He had a really rough life. He lived in Turkey, southern Turkey, in the era of after Christ, and was tortured several times through the Roman legions. I paired that with a second novel of a gentleman by the name of Fred. We never really find out his last name. He's just the everyman who has had it all and becomes homeless after some really bad decisions, goes to prison, comes out of it, and is taken in by a very kindly pastor of the Catholic Church in San Francisco. This is a real place. It's St. Dominic's Catholic Church in San Francisco, and I use the church as the background for the entire novel, all the way through it. And basically, we see the juxtaposition of how things used to be 1,700 years ago are still the same today. And we see making of a saint is a conscious choice between the two stories. I really did gain a lot of experience by writing this. I'd written short form, like I said, in different articles for years, but I'd never taken on a long-term piece like this before. So it was a very new experience. I learned mainly how to take a story and expand in somebody else's voice, not my voice. And to do that, you really have to get into the character's mind. You have to really delve into this research and make the research so a part of you that it comes out in the character's words. I also found out that particularly what we're here basically to do is love. But to know what the word love really means, we have to look at what the opposite of love is. The opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is selfishness. To truly love, we have to become selfless and to sacrifice. And that's one of the things that Fred, the modern day character, really learns all the way through the novel. That he's been very selfish and that he really needs to learn the idea of love. And that's one of the things that St. Nicholas, even in his modern day story, is able to teach him. The other interesting thing is I learned how to really beta test a novel. Really go out there, show the early novel to people, and really listen to what their ideas are. It's surprising. I showed my first novel to about 90 people and got some really great feedback that helped in the rewrites. What makes sense, what doesn't make sense. I'd like to hear more about this character. I think you really overwrote too much about this character. And finding that fine balance where the story itself is very acceptable and very accessible to the reading public. That really came home on this novel in particular. What impact I hope this novel has is to blow the dust off of the old statues in the church and really see who these people were. That's one of the main goals. We go into a church and we see the old holy saints, but we forget that they were real people, and we forget what they really had to go through. And this novel really takes you deeply into the experience of St. Nicholas and Fred, who basically by the end becomes a modern day saint. I also wanted to show that we all can become saints. That's what we're called to be, eventually saints. How do we get there? How do we do it? What do we need to go through to actually make this happen? The other thing is we all have trials in our life. I had tongue cancer. I was an opera singer for over 30 years. 3 years ago, I contracted or was diagnosed with tongue cancer. So they cut out half my tongue and put my wrist in place of my tongue. It's how we authentically face trials in our life that will be remembered for. If it's all about woe is me and why me and, why is this happening to me? That's okay, but that's how you're going to be remembered. If you can really internalize and realize that life honestly is not about me, it's what I do for others. That's what my life is really, truly about. And that's one of the things that I hope to take away from this novel. The last major thing on this novel is it's only through kindness, selflessness, giving of oneself, and sacrifice that we really do find the true kernel of love. It's really what we're here to do. And I'll show you the actual novel. It's a nice thick read, so if you have a long trip to take or a good weekend to read at the beach, go for it. That's the St. Nicholas Society. That's the actual cover. The next book I wrote, it was actually over a 12-year period of time. It's called True Love, 12 Christmas Stories My True Love Gave to Me. There's the cover. It was written over a 12-year period of time for my wife. My wife and I, early years of being in opera, we were poor as church mice. And the last thing we wanted to do is go out and buy a $200 and $400 gift for each other. We just didn't have the money. So we agreed. We also liked to give Advent gifts to each other. So we agreed that we would make or create some kind of gift for each other. Lisa loves embroidery, so she embroidered handkerchiefs for me. And I'm like, okay, I don't have a wood shop. I love working in a wood shop. We're in a small apartment. I don't have anything. So in the inspiration of the gift of the Magi, I started writing a story for her. I wrote the story of Partridge in a Pear Tree. Let's go with that. If it's good and she likes it, I have at least 12 years worth of stories I can create. She loved it. And what I would do is the first original book or the first original story was only 8 pages long. I'm sorry, 12 pages long. So I'd give her 1 page for like the first day of Advent. I'd give her, a couple of pieces of candy for the second day. Third day, I'd give her the second page. So I spread it out over the entirety of Advent. She loved it, which, hopefully your wife would love that, no matter whether she did or not, but she really did enjoy it. And by the middle of the year, she was already asking, okay, so what's the next subject going to be? What's the next story going to be about? What do I have coming up? And over the years, she started talking to me and saying, okay, this is going to turn into a book someday. This is going to turn into something. These are really good. Let's do something with these. So when I met with Sebastian on our first meeting, he asked, so what's next? What's your next book? I had no idea what was coming out of my mouth, but what came out of my mouth was 12 Days of Christmas. I have stories about these. And I gave him a thumbnail sketch. He's like, that's it. I want those. Give me those. Well, needless to say, I took all 12 stories and I had to break them down. And for instance, the 8 Maids of Milking originally was 89 pages long. Well, I couldn't just take it and give it to him like that. So I had to learn how to expand and contract all of these stories. That was a big challenge. All the stories are within 12 to 20 pages now to make the full book. And I wanted to give the book almost an Aesop's fable or Hans Christian Andersen feel to it. So I went to a friend of mine who's really an amazing graphic artist. She really is good at what she does. Her name is Courtney Boatwright. And I had her draw plates for the beginning of each chapter. So there you have a partridge in a pear tree. She did this and the cover for each one of the stories. And they really capture the character of each one of the stories. The big thing is a partridge in a pear tree is not just about a partridge. It's not the old traditional, okay, it's Christ on the cross is the reason for the partridge in a pear tree. These, we use the title of that one particular verse of the song, and then I compared it with guardrails, what I like to call, driving down the road between the ditches. You need to know where the ditch is at so you stay on track. One of them was obviously the title of that particular verse, and the other ditch was the 12 Boy Scout laws: trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly. And I teamed those with that one particular. My third guardrail was a parable. Each one of the stories actually retells, or continues one of the parables. For instance, number 8 is the continuation of what happens after the prodigal son. We all want to know, okay, great. It was a great story. Thank you, Jesus. But what happens after? Get the book. It'll tell you all about it. And the last book, which just came out this week, is The Farmer, the Miner, and the Artisan. Out of all things, Sebastian asked me to actually think about what would I do for a children's book, and he gave me the parameters. 3 people, a farmer, a miner, and a craftsman from 3 different regions gather stuff together that ultimately becomes 3 gifts for the Magi's delivery. So 3 stories in one that all come together at the end at the manger. Well, that was my marching order. Now what do I do with it? basically, I wanted to make sure that we had diversity. Everybody has a challenge of some kind. One person has one eye, another one is too tall, another one has one arm. Everybody has a challenge in this. And again, I went to Courtney Boatwright for the art scale. She's several years back. She had an exhibition in Chicago. For those of you that saw the dogs in Chicago, hers was the Sherlock Holmes dog that was featured on the Miracle Mile. So she's quite the artist. But this is the cover. You can see a bit of her artwork right there. And the big thing about this story that I really put together and really I wanted to bring out is each person is like a puzzle piece. We're all looking for that eternal puzzle. Where do we fit in? And it doesn't matter what your challenges are. Everybody has a place where they do fit in. We all have gifts, but the one gift we may actually touch most people with, we may not even realize we have. So being authentic, being who we are, is a gift to someone else. And I wanted to take the nativity narrative off of the pedestal that we have all put it on and let every child see themselves in that manger story. Doesn't matter what age that child is. It could be a 4-year-old. It could be a 90-year-old. So those are my 3 books. I hope everybody takes a look. Have fun.
Thank you, Ben. And one thing about Ben, I think he's got another dozen in the hopper.
Oh, yeah.
we will see more from Ben over time. So Daniel Fitzpatrick grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana, studied philosophy at the University of Dallas, and lives in Hot Springs, Arkansas, with his wife and 2 children. His poems and essays have been widely published, and his recent translation of Dante's Divine Comedy, illustrated by Canadian sculptor Timothy Smalls, on the occasion of the 700th anniversary of Dante's death, is a life-marking achievement. Daniel, take it away.
Thank you, Sebastian. And it's very good to be here with all of you. So Only the Lover Sings grew out of my experience of growing up in New Orleans, and especially of course, Hurricane Katrina. So I was a freshman in high school at the time that Katrina hit New Orleans. I had just started my first year at Jesuit High School there, and it was after our 4th day of school that we all had to evacuate for the storm. So my family moved kind of all around the country after that. So we went to St. Francisville, Louisiana, then to Dallas, Houston, over to Georgia for a little while, eventually back to Louisiana. And of course, so part of that was that our house was flooded. So we had 8 feet of water in the house for about 2.5 weeks. So of course the home, anything that was not in our cars was gone. We had to completely gut the house, strip it down to the studs, and rebuild it entirely. And so it was a year and 1 month before we could move back to our house. What was really interesting to me about that time, so a couple of things. One was that it was one of the most exciting times of my life. And I think it occurred at a really opportune time for me. So being 14, it was kind of an ideal age to go on an adventure of that sort. I can't imagine handling it now as a parent with young children and all the responsibility that comes with disasters like that. But as a child myself at the time, I found it incredibly exhilarating. I think something in the way of what Walker Percy talks about in a lot of his books, in the sense that we all, in some sense, crave disaster as a means of shaking us out of the just ordinariness of life. And so he has the really, really telling, question, I think, is like, are we really afraid that the bomb will go off, or are we more afraid that the bomb will not go off? Because so many of us are steeped in the kind of just complete ennui of the just sort of march of day-to-day, workaday existence, as Joseph Pieper puts it. What was really striking to me, in addition to this kind of exhilaration that I felt at the time, was the way that friends who were very close to me either experienced that in a similar way or in a completely opposite way. So, for example, my best friend growing up, who lived just 2 blocks away from me, we went to the same schools, had extremely similar upbringing. For him, the time of Katrina was a time of depression, sadness, ultimately of turning away from Catholicism to atheism. Whereas for me, it was quite the contrary. So I had been raised Catholic, but that moment of sort of tragedy was a time of deepening of faith and of an arrival at a kind of personal grasp on faith for myself. So looking back on those events for many years, I was really curious about this question of why does tragedy affect people in different ways, especially people who are very similar and who have grown up under almost identical circumstances. So Only the Lover Sings is in many ways an attempt to answer that question. And it does so by, I think, what I set out to do really with the novel was to demonstrate sort of look into the mythopoetic roots of a life. So essentially, the main narrative of the novel takes place over the course of probably about 4 months, from just before Katrina until almost December of that Katrina year. It's separated into 7 chapters, with each of the chapters taking its governing images from the corresponding day of the Genesis 1 creation account. So the first chapter, for instance, has a lot of light imagery. And the second chapter has a great deal of water imagery. This is when the flood happens. And so all of that, too, is then laid out against sort of a background of the narrative of Israel's history. And then each of the 7 chapters also has a short section at the beginning, which relates something from either earlier or later in the protagonist's life. So in the course of the 7 chapters, we are taken through the kind of crucial narrative of these few months around Katrina, but we also see glimpses into the protagonist's life from the time that he was very young until the time that he's about 20 years old. So about 6 years after the time of the main narrative of the story. And so what we see is kind of the book attempts to just give insights into the working of grace in someone's life, and what are the different factors that lead, kind of give that twitch upon the thread that Chesterton talks about in his Father Brown stories, and that Evelyn Waugh uses to such great effect in his Brideshead Revisited. The book was a lot of fun for me to write in that. So I'm very much influenced by many of the great modern authors. So, in prose, I've been very influenced by Faulkner and James Joyce. In poetry, I've been very much influenced by T.S. Eliot and Yeats, among others. And so their works, which are often treating of the same, I think many of the same fundamental questions. So questions of what place does faith have in the modern world? What are the poetic techniques that an author must have at his disposal in order to treat of experience in a holistic way that reaches out to the entirety of life and human experience without simply devolving into propaganda on some level, which I think is one of the greatest challenges for fiction writers today, especially living in a milieu where we're used to as people being sort of grouped, and I think this comes primarily through Marx and his influence on society. But we're used to being grouped into fundamental groups, whether that's the bourgeoisie or the proletariat, and then subdivided in many ways, basically to be used as power sources for those who pull the strings. And so much of fiction today, I think, falls into those same sort of narrative structures of dividing people simply into classes or types who can then be used to make some sort of point, rather than as individuals who are called to a personal encounter with Christ, which is kind of always what I'm driving at and trying to look into in my fiction, is that moment of personal encounter, which again, kind of we live in such a sociologically driven world, right? A world that is curious about studies and figures and statistics, whereas the world that I think is handed down to us from the scripture writers is one of the personal encounter. So I'm always so amazed at the life of St. Paul, where in many ways the whole drive of his life, the whole thrust of his work is founded on an anecdote, and we're told to stay away from anecdotes. And yet, what is the Christian life but the telling of an anecdote that I had an encounter with the Lord, and this changed me in some way. And so the novel, I think, is trying to, again, basically, take an anecdote and look at what are the ways that the Lord is operative in people's lives. How does the Lord operate in everything from what church you go to as a child, to what was the last thing that your godmother said to you before she died, and every moment of life that is that takes its existence from the loving gaze of the Lord, who continues to rejoice in what he creates, and continues to affirm it in its being. And so the book, which of course takes its title from St. Augustine through by way of Joseph Pieper, is in many ways a question of reaffirming that loving creative gaze of God, and of learning as an individual who is exposed to sort of the tragic fabric of human experience, to learn to gaze with God in love on creation, and to go beyond that also to, in sharing God's gaze, learning to be creative with him, to take the tragic moments of life, to take the moments of heartache and anguish, and out of that, not simply to despair and to turn away from the possibility of love, but to use those moments as moments to enter into the creative process. So one of the big questions for the central characters in the book has to do with how does one become an artist. So Roman, the main character, is very concerned with words, and with learning to tell stories, and with the ways that words open up sort of worlds within themselves, and the way that our words become moments of participation in the life of the word when they're used properly. Both of the main characters, both Roman and his best friend Francis, are very concerned with music as well. And so much of the creation story, and so much of the way that the creation story has been reflected upon by people like C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, concerns creation as song, as this jubilant vibration of the word bringing things into being. And so there's so much in the book about learning to be artists. And so in that process, coming to take a share in the creative life of God. It has been a great pleasure, I think, sharing this book with many of the people who in some way were involved with the book's coming into being. So with especially it was a moment of great healing in many ways to share this book with my best friend as a child, who the character Francis is heavily based upon him, and it was a great joy to hear him say what a gift it was to read the book, and how it really brought him back to that time, and I think helped him to see some of the fabric of what went into both of our experiences, and hopefully to see some of the influence of the divine there. But I've been very grateful to Sebastian for his support, as well as to Rhonda Chervin, who is instrumental in the book's coming to be. And thank you all very much for your time. I'm very delighted to be here with you to share this.
Certainly, Danny. And thank you for your presentation. I very much enjoy how you get into process and into meaning in the work that you're doing. So we will move to our next one. All right. Dr. James Papandrea is an award-winning author and professor of church history and historical theology. A Catholic layperson and catechist, Jim is recognized for his ecumenical work on behalf of the whole body of Christ. His book, The Squire's Journey, is the story of a journey written to help young people deal with grief and loss. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. I want to thank you, Sebastian, for everything that you do. Also want to thank Rick Akins, because it was through Rick that I found you, Sebastian, and that I was able to find a good publisher for this book. Like Sebastian said, my day job is as a professor of church history and historical theology. My primary field is the early church, but I do teach into the Middle Ages a bit, and I've had some fun teaching like Arthurian literature and stuff like that. And so this book, The Squire's Journey, is set in a kind of medieval but nondescript setting. And in fact, that photograph there is a picture I actually took. That's the medieval city of San Gimignano in Italy. And the way this book came about was interesting, because before COVID, we used to go to these writers' conferences in Madison, Wisconsin, at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And I got to know a literary agent there, and we were talking one time, and she said, there's really no good book out there to help like middle grade or young adults deal with death and loss. And so I thought about it, and I said, okay, challenge accepted. I'm going to write that book. Now, there are some things out there, but they tend to be too secular, The Fall of Freddie the Leaf or something like that for kids. But ultimately, the message there is that, when a person passes away, they live on in the memories of those who love them. And that's about all you get. And I wanted to do something that would be more specifically Christian, or even specifically Catholic. So I wrote the book thinking fully that this literary agent friend of mine would then represent it and pitch it to publishers. She chose not to represent it, I think, because in the end she felt it was too Christian, and that she felt that would limit its appeal. When we brought this book to publication, we toyed with a couple other titles. It's called The Squire's Journey. At one time, it was called The Great Reunion, because part of the theme of the book is that heaven is a family reunion. It's a reunion with all those that you've lost along the way. Another title that this book had for a while was The Shocking Fall, because the sort of central moment, or I guess the inciting incident, if you will, and I really appreciated Daniel's comments on disaster, because isn't it true that in a lot of stories, the inciting incident is often a disaster that sets a person on an adventure out of their ordinary world. And so in this book, the disaster is there are two brothers, and one of them dies very suddenly. And so the bulk of the book is the other brother's journey through that and beyond it. And he goes through the stages of grief, and the scope of the book then covers this young boy's whole life, and then beyond as he grows up and then and mentors another young boy. And so it's a bit, I don't know if you're familiar with these books. I tell people it's a bit like The Alchemist meets The Five People You Meet in Heaven. So if you're familiar with those books, it's kind of, it's that would be the elevator pitch there. And so I wanted to write a book that would actually help people deal with grief, that would give people a kind of eternal perspective on death and loss. But also I wanted to write a book that wasn't going to be only for grieving people or only for young adults or middle grade. So I tried to write a book that anyone would enjoy reading, that the story would be compelling for anyone. And I've actually gotten great feedback from both young people and adults on this. It was very interesting to write a story that covers the scope of really more than a whole lifetime. The last novel I had written before this was a historical fiction piece called A Week in the Life of Rome, for this series of books that were like sort of didactic historical fiction. And so, as the title suggests, I had to confine the story to 1 week. Everything had to happen in 1 week. And now this was sort of the opposite of that. It had more of an epic scope to it. And so it's really interesting to sort of have to try to balance narrative with allegory. And I mean, I guess this is sort of this was the argument between Tolkien and Lewis, right? You know, like how far do you go to make the allegory obvious, I guess. And Tolkien thought that Lewis's allegories were too obvious. And I think Lewis thought Tolkien was too obscure. And it's funny because my son is he's just finished his second master's degree in literature, and I'm the Catholic, and I'm more of a Lewis guy, and my son is the Protestant. He's more of a Tolkien guy. So we end up having these conversations a lot. But it was interesting to write a story that had that longer arc, and then again try to find the balance of the historical piece, but without making it too heavy, like it's a lecture. Still having the story be primary. So I do hope that this book will help people who are grieving, especially young people. But I also hope that this book will give anyone who reads it, no matter what age they are, a kind of bigger perspective, an eternal perspective, perhaps preparing for loss if someone hasn't experienced it yet. And I think of, Paul's comments in 1 Thessalonians. I was reminding my students just the other day, 1 Thessalonians is quite possibly the very first New Testament document that was ever written. And why did Paul even bother to write it? Because Christians were starting to die and Jesus hadn't come back yet. And so there's that whole beautiful part in chapter 4 where Paul says, yes, we grieve, but not without hope. Ours is not a hopeless grief. I'm paraphrasing Paul, obviously, but that becomes a kind of theme in the book. And then, in general, I think there are other life lessons in the book. My my secret agenda, maybe it's not so secret if you read the book, is that, I do want to kind of use the story to normalize in the mind of the reader faithful Christianity, and specifically faithful Catholicism. And Daniel, again, I will referring back to you, I take to heart your comments about, having to not let it become preachy and, turn a character into just a foil for, your own agenda. So there's definitely a balance to be struck there, but I wanted the book to have themes that would present people who are regular people, but who are faithful as well. And so there's a Eucharistic theme that runs throughout. And, at one point I have the young person saying, are we looking for the Holy Grail? And the answer is, every time we went to Mass, we found it, that sort of thing. And then finally, this bigger picture of the communion of saints. We talk a lot about connecting with the cloud in our world, and we forget about connecting with the cloud of witnesses, right? In the communion of saints. And so I think that's kind of, what I'm after with this book. And I'm very happy with the way it turned out, and I'm very grateful for Sebastian and for the ability to bring it to light. So I'm, it hasn't been out that long, and I'm kind of excited to see how the reception will go. I don't know how much time do I have, Sebastian? How are we doing here?
Oh, you can take the time you need.
Well, I was just wondering if maybe it would be, no one else has done this, but maybe it'd be appropriate to just read an excerpt. Would that be all right?
Oh, please do. Sure.
Okay. So this is the first page. And basically the first page is that moment of what I call the shocking fall. And then the rest of the book is a kind of the flashback before that, and then what goes on afterwards. So this chapter 1, the beginning of the quest. It happened so fast, faster than the speed of thought. It was over and done before young Rad knew it was even happening. If he had looked away for a second or blinked, he would not have seen it happen. And if he had not seen it happen, he would not have believed it, even if the one person he trusted most in the world had told him that it did. But it did happen. And even though Rad saw it, he could not think it. He stared into the open space with his mouth hanging and his breath held. He squinted his eyes to try to see the bottom of the void, but he could not. He strained his ears to try to hear a scream, but he could not. That is, until the silence was broken and the screaming he heard was his own. A mere moment ago, his older brother and only friend was almost close enough to reach out and touch. Now he was gone forever, and with no chance to say goodbye. Gone so suddenly. But perhaps we should start at the beginning of the story. This is the story of a journey, and every journey has a beginning. And so it goes from there. The main character, this young boy, his name is Rad. It's Radbertus Corby. And if you know your church history, you know that the Eucharistic controversy had these two characters with similar names, Radbertus and Ratramnus. And so I use those as the names of the two brothers. And the knight that they serve is Sir Lanfranc, which is another major theologian in the Eucharistic controversies in the Middle Ages. So there's a sort of hidden level of history in here where the names of the characters are names of actual people in the Middle Ages, important people in the life of the church. And then I couldn't resist the temptation to name the horses after the heretics in the controversy. So there is a horse named Arius, Ben. So just so that is the Squire's journey. And like I said, it's I don't know if others of you have had this experience, but it is difficult to find publishers who are willing to publish and promote fiction these days. And so for that reason, I'm grateful to Sebastian and to all of you, because I'm just super happy to hear about your work as well. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so very much, Jim. and we will introduce our final author for today, after which we'll enter into a Q&A. Lucy Underwood-Healy grew up in Cambridge, England. She received her BA in History and English from Oxford University and completed postgraduate studies at Cambridge University. A mother and scholar, as well as a writer, she lives in St. Albans, England, with her husband and children. Lucy's presence today from the motherland of England, the land of King Charles III, makes this an international webinar. Lucy, take it away.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. So over here there's neither a super cold front nor Florida sunshine, I'm afraid. It's cold and wet, and it's also dark because it's 5 p.m. So anyway, The Guest of Night, which is my novel, is my first work of fiction, my first foray into fiction. I am a historian, so it's not my first book, but my other published works are all scholarly works, and the research in those works comes out in footnotes and sort of carefully judicious arguments and references to other people's, to other people's scholarly work and all of that kind of thing. Whereas in The Guest of Night, the research has come out in works of imagination. So I totally second Ben's point that when you're trying to write a historical novel like this, you have to immerse yourself in the research, but then it has to, you have to wear it lightly. As one writer said to me, as one writer said, there's quite a lot of, because I know that, I don't have to put it in. You always want to know more. You always need to know more than you put on the page. Anyway, so why did I write The Guest of Night? Well, they always say you should write about what you know. So start with what you know. So I know Elizabethan England. So it's a case of starting with what you know. I was kind of doing the research anyway. There is a certain overlap between the subject of the novel and the subject of my doctoral research. I wrote it because I wanted a good story. I wanted to tell a good story, and I felt that this was a good story that it's rather less told, particularly in England. So I feel that it's a part of English history that not everyone is very aware of. I think I also wanted to tell a story from a new perspective. So I suppose I was trying to ask, well, what was it like? What was it like to be a relatively ordinary Catholic household in the 1590s? How did you deal with it? It's not just about the drama, is it? Because the high drama doesn't happen that often. What about the more everyday dramas, the sense of all of these dangerous and dark things which can be on the horizon, but in the meantime, you have to get on with it. Life for Elizabethan Catholics was not about martyrdom. It was kind of about avoiding martyrdom, for excellent reasons. So that's, I suppose, the story is trying to tell that story of people trying to live this situation and make it work. I wanted to tell the story using young people because that was the thing that sparked my imagination and led me into my doctoral research. I think also sparked my imagination in terms of telling a story. So my protagonists are young, they're teenagers, and I think much of the story rests on that they know more and they also know less about what is going on in the grown-up world than their parents think they do. So they live in this world which is still partly the safe world of childhood, where ultimately you kind of believe that nothing bad will really happen, that mummy is always there and daddy is all powerful. And on the other hand, they're half in this grown-up world where dark and dangerous things can happen. And they're on that adolescent threshold. And that is the thrust of the story. When I very first conceived of it, in a sense, I saw it as a children's novel. I'm not sure it is entirely a children's novel anymore, because as it grew, the adults got a lot more stage time, because part of the point of the story is that disjunction between where the children are and what the adults understand, and the reader knows both what the children know and what the adults know, but the adults don't know everything the children know, and the children don't know everything the adults know. So you needed those two stories. And of course, it is a coming of age novel in a way. They find their way over that threshold. Someone asked me once, what is it about? What three things is it about? I'd say it's about faith, it's about fear, and it's about friendship. And it's about what happens when what might be seen as a more childish, perhaps naive understanding of faith and the world and right and wrong encounters that complexity. And then there's a kind of thing that if faith is going to survive, it has to become a more adult faith. And so I think that's that sense. What I wanted to convey was that sense that it's of complexity, of people screwing up, that it's entirely possible to screw up while you're acting with the best of intentions. And how do we deal with that? And how can that be also comprehended in faith and in grace? The sense that we can screw up. We can end up doing the wrong thing precisely when we think we're trying hardest to do the right thing. So those, I suppose, are the issues. I think I'm no longer an adolescent. It's a long time ago, but I hope that this is something adolescents can relate to. This sense of facing the world with a deep sincerity, and of understanding both more and less than people think you do, and of that the challenge of what happened, of screwing up when you didn't mean to, and whether we can still salvage something of value from our screw ups. I enjoyed writing it. I learned how to write by writing the book. So that was great. I learned how to write. I learned a lot about history because I'm a historian of Elizabethan England. So it's kind of my territory. I should know all this already, but I'm not a textile historian. I'm not a historian of furniture. I'm not a historian of architecture. So I found myself having to read up all kinds of little bits of the period I study, which in the course of my professional life, I wouldn't necessarily have done. So that was great. I'm sure I didn't get it all right. I tried, but I bet I didn't. So I learned a lot from writing it. I think what I would hope to achieve from it is, I hope people would enjoy it. Actually, I hope people would just really enjoy this as a good story. I hope they would find some inspiration in it. There's a lot of it's an attempt to see ordinary, flawed people who still occasionally manage to get things right. So I hope people might find that inspiring and encouraging. And I really wrote in a way I did not. I ended up publishing with a Catholic publisher, but I did not write this book for Catholics in a way. I wrote it in the hope that wrote it in the hope that people who are not Catholics would also enjoy this book, perhaps learn something about, perhaps become aware of a story that of a part of history that they hadn't been aware of, a tale that's less told. So yeah, I mean, this is don't just buy this for your godchildren. Get this book for your non-Catholic friends. This is for your non-Catholic friends and family. The people who readers so far have included non-Catholics who have loved this book and have not felt they were being preached at, because I didn't want to write a preachy book. I'm not interested in a story in which you line the heroes up on one side and the villains up on the other side, and it's that simple, and then you plug it for the heroes. Partly because that doesn't make a very good story, and partly because it wasn't like that. And so I'm very aware the history of Reformation in England was a history in which people suffered for their principles on both sides of the argument. There was a persecution of Catholics in Elizabethan England. There was also intense persecution of Protestants in the previous reign, and so that too is part of the story and is part of the book. Because I did want to try. I mean, look, it's set when it's set, and so that the Catholics get most of the stage time. But my aim was to reach out and try to empathize with all the characters and all the viewpoints. And yeah, it's not a lineup of heroes and villains. It's a lineup of people who are all Christian people. And I suppose the fundamental tragedy behind the whole story is the tragedy of that the mutual bloodshed between Christians, that all these people are good people and yet they somehow manage to do terrible things to each other. Yeah, so I'm not going to go into the plot because I don't want to, because that would be telling. I want you to read the book. I want you to buy it for all the non-Catholics in your life, and then come back and tell me how you like the plot and whether you'd like a sequel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy. I would definitely like a sequel. But that's me. Well, this has gone very well. We've had presentations from all 5 of our authors, and now we're going to move into our Q&A. Thank you for presenting your work, and I hope that the participants here and the viewers who will watch this later, once it's posted in our various media outlets, will honor these 5 authors by reading their work and by sharing with them their thoughts. At this point, we'll move into our question and answer period. We have a few that have already been posed, and the first one is for our very own Ben Bongers. Ben, someone asked, what is the primary resource for the Arius episode, and where does that first appear?
The Arius episodes, and I wrote quite a bit about the heresy of Arianism and their meetings. A lot of it comes from Eusebius. There were also a lot of writings from Alexander of Alexandria. And I'm here to tell you the toughest part about writing those chapters was the town of Alexandria, the priest and actually bishop's name of Alexander, dealing with all of the Alexanders, and you'll understand this because your own child is named Alexander. It was just trying to constantly back and forth. Is it the place? Is it the person? Is it the diocese? What are we talking about here? There were about 5 main resources. There's a very big story of St. Nicholas of Myra meeting Arius at the Nicene Council and actually hitting him. Actually, he was so angry at Arianism and everything it did to the church. Well, we're finding out through research and through a lot of the writings at the time, it may or it may not have been Nicholas. Nicholas became the fall guy. It may very well have been the deacon who was speaking on behalf of the rest of the bishops, and particularly for Alexander of Alexandria, who wasn't at the council. They think the deacon was actually the one that hit Arius. Nicholas just happened to be in the proximity and was blamed for it. Nicholas actually was trying to be a peacemaker. In fact, Constantine asked Nicholas to write to Alexander and the other people that were taken off in handcuffs and put on an island somewhere. Nicholas was asked by Constantine to actually communicate with them and see if they would recant and come back to the church itself. So if you were the guy that actually hit him, you probably wouldn't be asked by Constantine to try to be the peacemaker. So.
Thank you, Ben. This next question is for everybody. So Matt Gephardt says, Ben's collection of pins in the background got me wondering. How do each of you capture ideas for your writings? Do you sit down at a computer and type it out, write it longhand on paper, or some other method? Who would like to respond first?
For me, part of the problem with writing is, especially longhand writing, it's very, for me, I can't read my own writing first. And second, it's very mentally draining for me. So the last thing I want to do is write something out longhand and then misplace it or can't read it or whatever. So I usually during the day, I'll have my phone open to Microsoft, the notebook, and just try to, I have a little subdirectory for each thing that I'm working on and just get my notes into there first. And then when I start actually writing, I'll do it through a program called Scrivener, which is very helpful, I think, for nonfiction books and novels. There's probably a lot of bells and whistles in there that I never even use, make it even easier, but that's how I proceed with the process.
Thank you, Rick. Danny?
Yeah, I was going to say, so I used to write everything longhand first. So I have a, which is kind of fun, like for Only the Lover Sings, and then for a novella that I wrote after that, and for most of the Dante translation, I have like handwritten first drafts of everything, which I found very useful just for editing myself, for first having to kind of go slowly as I wrote the first draft, and then having to go over it again in the process of transcribing it. Then I've slowly, as I've had more children and less time, I've transitioned now to where I do almost everything on my phone now, which is not how I would like to do it. Ideally, I would much prefer to handwrite first and then transcribe. But I've just found as a practical matter that I will write a great deal more if I just do it on my phone, because I have my phone kind of sadly with me all the time. So, if it's, if I find I'm sitting in the car waiting for a child to finish with an appointment or something, I can take the phone out, write a couple paragraphs, and then, have done something. It's also easier to be stealthy in the morning. Like if I wake up very early and the kids are still asleep, I don't have to turn any lights on in the house. I don't have to start making noise, getting books out and writing. I can just hunker on the couch and, type away on my phone. So I've become a pragmatist in that respect over time.
I can jump in, I out of Mother of Invention, when I started writing the St. Nicholas Society, I had a bit of an accident and tore off my right bicep. So while I was in a sling, trying to type left-handed was impossible. So I picked up Dragon Speak, and I've had several other programs that you can actually speak dialogue into. And it prints everything you say, anything from commas to you name it, it's all there. And then later on, you can go back and edit. Usually I'll do one page, go back, edit, if it messes up a word or a punctuation, I'll have it edited at that point. And from that point, after I got used to both hands again, I went back and I started just typing dialogue and everything back in. I realized actually typing it in took 3 times longer than just speaking the dialogue. So you start training yourself and saying, begin quote, I went to blah, 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 end quote, and next paragraph. It writes the entire thing out for you very quickly, and it allows you to go back and edit on your own time frame, but you get your initial ideas down. And then for me, the other thing is I always have a notes section in my cell phone, and I just go to that notes section. I hit record. I speak directly into that notes section, and it'll either just write it down for me, or I go back and I listen to the notes later on and transcribe that. But for me, I found that writing that quick, it makes it so much quicker and easier.
This is delightful to hear these processes. Rhonda Chervin, who gave us our opening prayer, has a book coming out very soon called Short Takes, and it's a series of interviews she did on WCAT radio. I downloaded the interviews as audio files and uploaded them to otter.ai, which did a transcription of each of the interviews, or each of the audios. And then Rhonda went through and she edited them, and we're publishing that as a radio show series of interviews turned into written text. Another one of my authors, Dennis Bonnet, has written a series of 41 essays that comprise a book called Demolishing Skepticism. So these are written in text form. I uploaded them to Speechulo.com, and Speechulo converted them into artificially intelligent voiced audios. And so we're able to publish an audiobook. So using these two methods has really made the collection and publication process very versatile for En route Books and Media. So there's possibilities here as well for your own works, converting them to audio, or if they're audio files, converting them to video or to written text. We have another question. Christina Olson, who is the author of a book, Principles of Change, about St. Teresa of Avila's reform efforts, which was just translated into Spanish, by the way. It's now available in the Spanish language. She writes, what might alert me to the suspicion that the author of a novel I'm reading is Catholic, if the subject is not related to Catholic or Christian issues? What characteristics would likely shine through the text? Anyone can answer that one.
I mean, for me, I think, and I dealt with this a little bit in the novels that I wrote under a pseudonym too. I'm writing these characters and I'm trying to make them be like normal people, like people you can relate to, people you might know. And yet you sort of have to go out of your way to say, on Sunday, they went to mass, or, grandma so-and-so prayed her rosary, or, something that would, like a non-Catholic author, unless they were, specifically creating a Catholic character for a particular reason, wouldn't put those things in there just for an average person. And these are sort of elements of a person's life that, have to be intentional. So I don't know if that's good or not, honestly. I don't know if that turns readers off or if it endears them to Catholicism. I'd like to think the latter, but I mean, just the idea that, and I mean, you probably know this, but we live in a culture where it's just not assumed that people are necessarily faithful Christians or Catholics. And our daughter was talking to her manager where she works about being off on Sunday mornings, and she got attitude for that. Like, what, you go to church? Like, who does that? Well, that. So anyway, that's my thing.
Anyone else with markers of Catholicism?
Yeah, I have one. It's I would love to say quick and easy, but it's not. And that is really get to know the catechism of the religion very well beforehand, if you can. There are many times I'll be reading something, not knowing their background, and all of a sudden a little light goes off. It's like, oh, wait a minute, that's a bit heretical. Woo, where are we coming from here? Where are we going with this? So really knowing your faith. I actually trained many years ago to be a teacher. I taught full-time for 6 years. In fact, I'm still teaching for Penn State. The best way to teach, honestly, is to act as a student. What are they hearing? And if you can actually go through and really, if I were to teach this, how would I teach it? Listen to things or read things with a teacher's eye. How would I teach what I'm reading? And if bells and whistles quickly go off, yeah, I can't teach that because I know the truth is this, then you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt as to whether or not it's actually from a Catholic perspective.
Danny?
Yeah, so one thing I would say that's perhaps a little more general is that I think a work that is Catholic will, in some sense, be liturgical. And I'm trying to think of how to say this without taking too long on it. But essentially, so Ratzinger makes the point in his book, The Spirit of the Liturgy, that so like in Plotinus, for instance, and I think in many other sort of metaphysical systems, including the way that a lot of people view the world today, there's a sense that everything in creation is a kind of depreciation of being as it falls away from God. And so a kind of like existential lessening of everything on a kind of like in a moral sense, even, so that matter, man, and kind of everything as it gets farther away from God is farther away because it is all falling away from God rather than being a loving exitus from the love of the Trinity. And that the reditus, the return to God, is therefore, I think in a lot of people's systems, a lot of people's views, like a pure matter of the sort of will and escaping from the world around me, and like kind of discovering the self in contradistinction to the world around. Whereas I think the kind of like what the history of Israel shows us, what kind of a biblical worldview points us to is the idea that, in fact, like again, I mean, creation is not a simple falling away from God by like layers of being that simply can't hold on to that level of intensity that God has, and so they of necessity kind of devolve into lower and lower levels, but rather that the world is God's willed and beloved act that he continues to carry out, and that therefore the return to him is going to involve a like joyful participation in his process of loving and willing and redeeming the world. So I think a genuinely Catholic work ought to have that character to it of not simply sort of despairing of the world, not simply trying to see how can the self of the character assert itself against everything else and discover itself in that process of assertion, but how can the character learn to hear kind of the fundamental call of the voice of God creating and loving what he has made, and of desiring it to be unified with him, which I think is that's I think more of an I think that's more tonal, that's more more sort of general, I guess, than, what are the things that characters are specifically doing or saying. What are the practices they have that might reveal their Catholic or Christian identity? But there's something more in the kind of the fabric of the worldview that's presented within the world of the story.
Thank you, Danny. Anyone else? Lucy, go ahead.
So yeah, I don't know. So what makes a Catholic novel? How can you tell a Catholic novel? I have to say, I often find that if you're reading a novel by a Catholic, I often find I can work it out. Like, even if the novel isn't explicitly Catholic, I suppose it takes one to know one. You can just tell. So how, what is it that you can do? I mean, I think that the thing is, if you are a Catholic, is that if that is deeply part of your mind and your reality, then it will be part of the fiction that you write. It's a bit like it's almost what you're capable of imagining. I don't want to go off on a tangent about him, but the Lord of Tolkien's fantasy novels are fantasy. God is never mentioned, Christ is never mentioned, but the thing is, they're deeply Christian because if you kind of, they are compatible with Christianity. Everything in his fantasy world is in a way compatible with the reality of God and the incarnation. And if you're geeky enough to have read some of his sort of unpublished stuff, you will realize that in his head, he could not achieve secondary belief in his secondary creation unless it was compatible with Christianity. Because Tolkien speaks very well about how obviously fiction doesn't command primary belief. We don't believe that it literally really physically happens, but it must command secondary belief, a sense that it could have happened, that it is consistent logically and philosophically with reality. And I think that if Catholicism is your primary belief, then your secondary creations, which are only meant to command secondary belief, will be compatible with that primary belief. And they will speak of it, and they may well communicate some of it even to people who don't share it. But I think, and I think in some ways it works better the less you try to do it, because I remember Dorothy Sayers, another great Christian writer, and she says somewhere, the thing is that if Christian art does not pass muster as art, it will also fail as Christian art. If it is not good and true as art, it will fail as Christian art. So in some ways, your faith is there. It's just there. And then you write a good story. And in some ways, it works better, like the less explicitly you try. At least, yeah. That's my take. I mean, I think there's some fiction tackles the spiritual more explicitly than others, and both can be great. Both can produce great fiction. But yeah, your primary belief will shape your secondary creations. And if your reader's awake, they'll detect it. I mean, I think in practical terms as well, there are little things that a non-Catholic writing about Catholics will sort of have to strain quite hard to get right, and will sometimes not get quite right. Whereas as someone who is a practicing Catholic, you just know, you don't have to think about, details like how people actually pray, or what it's actually like going to church, or, whether the rosary works as a soporific, and things like that, which to a Catholic are just kind of there, and you can slip them in sometimes with humor, in ways that a non-Catholic will sometimes there's a sense that if you're writing from outside the tradition, you'll kind of try too hard and just not quite get what things can be taken seriously and what things can be worn a bit lightly. But there you are. That's I suppose just being a bit but that's, I think, a separate thing from a slightly separate thing from the worldview, and your primary belief will shape your secondary creations.
Thank you, Lucy. That's an excellent segue into a nuanced question that Meg Kudrowski has posted. She says, some of you have talked about Catholic versus Protestant sensibilities in fiction. Where do you feel the messages of your work differ from, and where are they similar to recent Protestant offerings in novels and film? And her examples are Francine Rivers and The Chosen. You've got the grand meta-narrative of our Catholic tradition. How does it flow into the that of the Protestant tradition? How do we know the difference? And Meg has joined us on camera, by the way. So Meg, did you have another thought concerning that question?
No, I just meant don't necessarily limit your answer to the specific examples I gave, but there's a lot. I'm based in California. I feel like there's a lot of Protestant or Protestant-led Christian fiction offerings, and I'm interested in exploring a little bit more what are the unique gifts of the Catholic fiction offerings.
That's an open question. Rick, had your hand up first.
I beat you to it, Ben. Just to your example with The Chosen, I think, I haven't watched every episode, but the parts that I did watch, I thought you couldn't really tell, whether it was obviously a Christian story told by people who understood Christianity, but I don't know if you could really tell that it was Protestant versus Catholic. And even though the people that produced it were Protestant. But I have seen other Protestant works and other writings that, and we're not immune to this as Catholic writers, but seem to be a little more preachy in terms of trying to push a message and, depending on the background of the Protestant writer or producer, maybe being tied a little bit more toward, being verbatim from things that they read, from Scripture. Whereas maybe Catholics have a little bit more flexibility. We feel a little more comfortable. Like in my story, it's based on things that we read about in Scripture, but the characters are not, it's not verbatim from things that we read in there. So I didn't feel any constraint from that standpoint of it's not even embellishing. It's just trying to think through like what would the actual people of that time live with, and not feeling my main character is Jewish, and I didn't feel any hesitation in putting out there that this person at the beginning of the story did not believe in Jesus. So I think in my mind that's kind of the main difference that I've seen, is just a little bit more ability for Catholic producers and writers to not feel as like they have to get a message across. Just tell the story, put the message in there where you can. Don't shy away from it, But at the end, don't sacrifice the story and the entertainment of the story and bring people to read it or watch it. Don't sacrifice that just to try to get a little bit more forcefully, a person's story across.
To me, there are positives even to Protestant literature. I mean, it's a Christian-based literature. I see very little wrong with that until it crosses some pretty obvious lines. For instance, back in the 80s, I think it was, there was a whole series of books about the rapture. And the whole idea of, we're all going to go to heaven in this grand rapture, this, that, and the other. Well, unfortunately, it's exactly the opposite of what actually is spoken about in Revelations. So the readers of the Protestant side got it wrong. So you have to be careful of what is actual Catholic tradition, what actually is in the catechism, what actually our base is, and then just judge things against that. Again, 90% or more, 98% is going to jive with, or, the stories will work as a Christian story. It's just those little idiosyncrasies that you have to look out for.
I suppose, so I'm not familiar with a lot of contemporary Protestant Christian fiction, I'm afraid. So, and also I sort of hesitate to say, well, the difference with Catholic fiction before it kind of segues into saying, well, Catholics are just better. I suppose in a market where we feel that there is quite a lot of Christian Protestant or Protestant-led fiction, I suppose one thing that we can add is sort of subject matter. I mean, if we're thinking about the sorts of things that perhaps our teenage children might read, as an alternative or as well as at least secular literature, which assumes that nobody believes in God and nobody has a problem with, sex before marriage. And if they want to read material that's more consonant, where the characters live more consonant with their values, So what can Catholic fiction add to that milieu is perhaps just that adding that subject matter that the characters are going to, if the characters go to church, it's a Catholic church, the pastor figures that appear might be Catholic as well as Protestant, that just the content, I think perhaps can provide a useful complement, and if we write it in the right way, our fiction needn't be unsympathetic to Protestant Christian readers. And so perhaps in that way that it can help with a kind of, cultural exchange between Christians of different traditions. I think if there's anything sort of deeper, I don't know. I think in some ways that belief, it's the general Christian worldview, I think unites Catholic or Protestant fiction perhaps more than it seemed divided. You could argue that profoundly Catholic fiction perhaps is more sacramental. I mean, if you compare C.S. Lewis Christian fantasy by a Protestant with Tolkien Christian fantasy by a Catholic fantasy by a Catholic Christian, you get this kind of where Lewis goes for allegory, Tolkien goes for, I think, sacramentality. But perhaps there's something in that our sacramental worldview, that we do believe that, grace can be challenged, grace can come through material things. Perhaps that can be something that's come through in Catholic fiction more strongly than in Protestant fiction. But I think I think it's something that we should, obviously I think it's something that we should keep doing, because I think there's obviously a desire for Christian fiction, and I think just in terms of content and of broadening that discussion and just broadening that what's available and enriching it. I think certainly we can add, and it doesn't need to be exclusive.
One thing I might say on the matter is, so first on the subject of The Chosen, while there are slight things I think that show up that indicate the Protestantism of Dallas Jenkins and some of the other folks involved. But I think what most strikes me about the series is that what they seem to be doing in thinking about how they're going to shoot it, and thinking about the backgrounds of the different apostles. It seems to me like they're really doing like basically Ignatian meditation. And they're really doing like a kind of spiritual exercises with the gospel to try to enter imaginatively into the lives of the characters. So I think what they're doing is, I think even the fact that that the guy who plays Jesus is a devout Catholic. I think there's a lot of ecumenical hope involved in a project like The Chosen, which I think really needs to always be kind of a point of urgency for artists, to always keep in mind that that the division of Christians is a great scandal to the world, and that in our divisions we're doing so. We're so far from Christ's priestly prayer for us. And so I think that should always be something that's kind of urgently driving Christian artists, is a desire for union among all Christians. One thing that I think is, and I have a friend he's a Jesuit priest, but he's doing a PhD in literature at SMU right now. And what he's writing on is kind of the loss to the imagination that's incurred by many of kind of the early wave, like great Protestant poets. So his sort of thesis is that in the works of someone like George Herbert, we can detect a great feeling of longing for the imaginative freedom that Catholicism opens up, and in distinction to kind of some of the imaginative limitations that are placed upon you by Protestant doctrine. I think we see some of that in there's a certain freedom, and of course there's the never-ending question of, was Shakespeare Protestant or Catholic? But certainly his imagination involves all of the doctrinal openness that I think Catholicism gives. Whether it's questions of, even in dealing with the person of Hamlet's father, what are we, where's the place of purgatory in the question of this restless figure coming from beyond the grave, and there's a similar freedom, imaginative freedom, that we see in someone like Shakespeare and someone like Dante, where there's this tremendous leeway that the imagination has just to play, that I think is not quite there once a kind of Protestant imagination takes hold. So there's a lot of interesting criticism kind of comparing, and this is even just secular criticism, kind of comparing Dante and Milton, and two obviously tremendous artists. But there's a lot that I've come across kind of about the limitations that Milton has, and kind of the enclosure of the universe that he creates in Paradise Lost, compared to just the vastness of Dante's cosmos. So I think that would be one thing that's kind of key, is that I think Catholic art gives the greatest possible scope to the imagination, and that applies. Just Catholicism in general allows for the greatest possible integration of all experience and all knowledge. Whether that's in art, whether that's in science, or just any other human pursuit.
That is a beautiful response, Danny. Thank you for that. We have time for one last question, and it comes from John Underwood, directed through Monica Underwood to Lucy Underwood-Healy. So,
yeah, we are related.
John asked, in The Guest of Night, we see the characters, even children, engaging in fairly nuanced theological conversation. How common was discussion of this kind across different classes and age groups in the period?
Okay, so yeah, thank you. So how common was it? I don't know. I'm an early modern historian. We don't do statistics most of the time. We just pile up anecdotes until we think we've got enough. But did it happen? Yes. I have the primary sources. People talk about having theological discussions, reading theology, including when they're teenagers. And as for class, I wouldn't bet. Yes, again, yes. Even between people described as servants or as craftsmen, fairly lower class. Yes, this did happen. And that's why it's in the book. In fact, I think in the book, I cut down the theological arguments. I think they would have had more in real life, but there's a limit to how much a modern reader will take. And we know it still happens. John, do you not remember the humdinger of an argument you had over the Immaculate Conception with one of your friends when you were 15? Because I do. So yeah, I have the primary sources. It is consonant. It did happen.
Well, then that's cool. And of course, remember, a theological discussion and discourse was their media back then, in an age where there was such controversy around the relationship between Catholicism and Protestantism.
There was so much print literature, and print literature was just becoming cheap. Yeah.
Right. So
there was oral sources, because people used to listen avidly to sermons in those days, and I'm sure and therefore they could pick up those arguments that they'd heard and relay them and discuss them. So yeah.
Sure. Well, I was going to point out they didn't have the distractions of iPhones or YouTube or any of the other distractions we have through our media today that are coming to us from every direction. Well, we're at the end of our time. I want to thank everybody for their participation. The authors who have presented here today have given us excellent content and things to think about. I encourage everyone to buy their books and to help support their future works as well. I am going to close this in a prayer. So if you would, join with me. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, we ask in Christ's name that he continue to assist our Catholic novelists in their work, that they might help to capture and continue to capture the imagination of their readers, evangelizing the world through their writings. May they inspire others, young and old, to carry our faith tradition into future generations. Continue to bless our authors and our viewers and their readers. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
So thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
This is great.
Have a great rest of your weekend.
Thank you. Bye.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.